Thank you, brethren, for that. Next on the agenda will be about our Freemasonry and the changes in history that we've had in the last 300 years, which the lecture will be delivered by Worshipful Brother Brendan Kine, Junior Warden, as well as very worshipful Brother Matteo Donato, our Senior Warden, which I will, as soon as I can find Brendan's name, Brendan, can you unmute yourself?
Done.
I will hand the lodge over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Worshipful Master. This evening we're going to have a quick look at how Freemasonry has changed and how we've got to the Endeavour Lodge today. But what Matt's going to open with is sort of a kind of philosophical overview of whence come Freemasonry. And then I'll pick it up from there and have a look at the 1700s, the 1800s and the 1900s, very briefly in 10 minutes, how the concept of the lodge has changed and the concept of education has changed in each of those 3 centuries. But first off, over to you, Matt, for the introduction.
Well, thank you very much, Brother Junior Warden. Yeah, as you said, a bit of a sort of a deviation to what I was asked to do, but I thought there was a lot of relevance considering the debate behind the virtual lodge before we sort of got it off the ground. So I'll just start it off reading the paper. Our modern industrial societies value the person who is willing and able to initiate and respond positively to change, and yet organisations that attempt to initiate such changes are often stymied by the individuals or groups within those organisations who resist the changes. Often we find that reasons for the resistance are easily identified. Perhaps the benefits to the organisation are not necessarily consistent, and in some cases may seem to be conflicting with the interests of the individual being asked to make the change. Nevertheless, some individuals seem to resist even the changes that are consistent with their interests. Despite what we may consider as resistance to change, it is evident that we as a society have changed. The lens with which we view the world today is very different to the lens society used 1,000, 500 and even 20 years ago. Traditional and modern are widely used as polar opposites in a linear theory of social change. However, it is incorrect to view traditional society as static, consistent or structurally homogeneous. The relationship between the traditional and the modern do not necessarily involve displacement, conflict or exclusiveness, nor does modern weaken tradition. Both traditional and modern can form the basis of ideologies and movements in which the polar opposites are converted into aspirations. Freemasonry in the early days not only established systems of social networks, but proactively worked to change the world, teaching society many great lessons. But we as Freemasons now become resistant to not only the concept of change, but change itself. According to Joseph Newton, 2 arts have altered the face of the earth and given shape to the life and thought of man: agriculture and architecture. For man is not only a planter and a builder, but a mystic and a thinker. Hence, when we inquire into the origins of architecture, which is considered the matrix of civilization, we find that there are 2 fundamental factors that compel this art to be brought forward: physical necessity and spiritual aspiration. In essence, it could be postulated that the early Freemason identified this physical and spiritual connection when they began to lay the foundations of what we call now speculative masonry. So while the origins of Freemasonry have long been debated and will continue to be a topic of discussion, whatever may have been lost through the passage of time, it is the symbolism which is considered as the soul of Freemasonry that can be still traced in an unbroken succession through the centuries. This is seen in the speculative mason who has picked up from where the craftsman finished his labours and laid down his tools, and the symbols which would serve the faith of the worker became the language or the thoughts of the thinker. The craft of the stonemasonry is one of the oldest trades in human history, dating back some 10,000 years, when man first began to fashion tools and weapons with stone. It wasn't until the beginning of what is referred to as the Neolithic Revolution that man began to transition from the hunter-gatherer to the the agricultural settlements to the builder. Through the ages, the work of the stonemason has become so ubiquitous that it can be clearly seen that no single trade has left such an indelible mark on our landscape. However, man would not have achieved such heights without the understanding and implementation of what we refer today as the 7 liberal arts and sciences. It is no surprise that liberal arts education can claim to be the oldest program of higher education in Western history. These liberal arts were the subject of skills that in the classic antiquity were considered essential for the free person to know in order that they can take part in civil life. But while not all Masons may have been versed with the knowledge of the liberal arts, it is apparent that the overseers, who would be learned and able to articulate concepts to the Mason in a manner and a media that was clearly understood, that began the transformation of what we see today. The formation of this hierarchy model builder, overseers and worker may well be the foundation of what is modern times is considered as the structured organisation. And through the ages, the fusion of the organisational culture, the science and the theological set the foundation for our forefathers to build many great buildings. This antiquity now brings with it a legitimacy, an authority and a sense of unbroken tradition and belonging and a sense of social acceptability. With human population increasing exponentially, the need for quicker building techniques meant that the world was becoming less reliant on the stonemason and more dependent on other resources and skills. It was this tradition which was traditionally accepted as having given rise to the speculative mason and in turn be postulated as the pivotal point that has brought the study of the liberal arts and sciences to the world. The transition from operative to speculative saw the tools of the tradesman become the allegoric symbols of the thinker, an enabler that has allowed the evolution of modern day Freemasonry. This evolution was only possible through the fact that education essentially belongs to the nature of Freemasonry, connecting the very nature of education with development of the skills to carry out work. The connection that work involves education was never dreamed of in Greece and Rome, was not seen in the Middle Ages, and would have aroused a sense of horror in that time. Irrespective of our beginnings, Freemasons have been innovators and free thinkers. One could only surmise the impact and thoughts of the men trained in geometry, arithmetic and science of building, opening their doors and allowing outsiders to partake in their art before the mid-1600s. The men that paved the way of the future were special due to the fact that they possessed great skills in order to create castles, cathedrals and palaces. Sculpted works and ornaments demanded of their masters, and when we look back, it almost seems like they possessed magical skills. They were clearly the elite and the labour force that had the secret customs and marks that would attract some of the brightest non-educated recruits. The modern world should be grateful that they chose to share this magical art with the world at large. Aristotle wrote, "It is the experience, not the knowledge imparted, that permits the initiate to understand the secret meaning of the mysteries. It is the state of being that comes about through a ritualistic experience that strikes at the man's core. It creates not merely a re-examination of life, but an abandonment of his former life, and a new man becomes more self-aware by experiencing a spiritual awakening." Today, the tradition of forethought continues within the halls of Freemasonry, and the internet has become another media demonstrating how the traditional and modern can be intertwined to enhance the aspirations and experience of Freemasonry. We have opened our doors to the world, and by doing so have created a truly global environment, welcoming visitors from all over the world. This is truly the ability to reach beyond our borders and become part of the global community. Over to you, Brother Kine.
I think there's a future paper at Lodge of Research coming up there somewhere. Thank you for that, Matt, and that's quite a good introduction. I hope people took notes for maybe some discussion afterwards. Luckily, I'm going to give you lots of pictures to look at as we go, but Matt touched on there a couple of times the important point of education. And that's one of the themes I'll quickly look at. So we're going to have 300 years of history in 10 minutes. So I'll just pop this on to give you something to look at. Have I shared that? No. First off, I'll share. There, that's better. Everyone got that? Excellent. So I'm going to pick up the story from the 1700s, from when Freemasonry becomes public and formalised instead of largely unknown and ad hoc. And with the foundation of this lodge, we're embarking on new ways to meet as a lodge and engage in education and sharing ideas. So in that vein, let's look at the development of Freemasonry in the 1700s, the 1800s and the 1900s from the perspective of what constituted a lodge and what constituted education. And the curious thing is, in each one of these decades, in each one of these centuries, in the second decade of each one, there is huge fundamental changes to Freemasonry. We're not talking subtle little changes, we're talking huge fundamental changes. So let's start off then. Now bear in mind this is a broad 300 years in 10 minutes. I'm going to make lots of gross generalizations and I hope some of you disagree with them. Now, in the early 1700s, we know that in England, and in London in particular, lodges were meeting in a variety of venues, but primarily in taverns and clubs. The more wealthier lodges were meeting in dining rooms of manor houses and those early gentlemen's clubs. For example, the lodge at York was meeting at the Merchants' Hall in the city of York. And down the bottom there is that Merchants' Hall, which still exists today. Of the four lodges that formed the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster in 1717, 3 of those lodges consisted of an average membership of 15, whilst the 4th lodge, the Rummer and Grapes Tavern Lodge, was composed of gentlemen of rank, such as the Duke of Richmond, and it had a membership of around 70 people. So just over 120 people formed that first Grand Lodge. Lodge membership in the main during this period was not very large and was limited in part to the size of the venues they were meeting in, such as the meeting in a small upstairs room of a tavern. And you can see in that drawing up the top right-hand corner there, they're all kind of, it's only about 15 people in that picture, but they're all kind of crowded around the table. Now, I'm going to have a look at some of the lodge rooms from that period as well. Now, what constituted education in the 1700s? And here we get to the catechisms, the question and answers. As many of you know, Masonry Dissected, published in 1730 by Samuel Pritchard, is a good example of these catechisms. It consisted of 91 question and answers for the entered apprentice, 30 for the fellow craft, and 29 for the master mason. And part of a lodge meeting included working the catechism round the table. And there's Mr. Pritchard there, and part of his Masonry Dissected, not Defected. And we're going to touch just briefly on the left-hand side there, which is William Preston's illustrations of Masonry. However, education in some lodges in the 1700s would appear to be more than just these catechism lectures. In 1726, Dr. Francis Drake, surgeon, antiquary and vicar, delivered a ration to the Grand Lodge of York, meeting in that Merchants' Hall, and in terms of Freemasonry in York, Drake believed that, and I quote, "Every gentleman who is called a Freemason should not be startled by a problem of geometry, a proposition in Euclid, or at least be wanting in the history or just distinctions of the 5 orders of architecture." Or Masonry Triumphant from 1736. "I would here particularly recommend to the brethren that they never pass a lodge night without discourse upon the study of geometry and architecture." So from here we can only assume that some lodges in the 1700s had an expectation of the intellectual ability of their members, and that serious discussion was taken on issues such as geometry and architecture. However, in the latter 1700s, we find there's a beginning to the change to those question and answers you can see on your right-hand side of the screen there, with further explanatory information. Much of this taken from Preston's illustrations of Freemasonry. I just picked 2 bits at random here. They're both from the Victorian first degree, and see if they sound familiar, but this isn't ritual, this is the writings of William Preston. I have the pleasure to congratulate you on being accepted a member of this ancient and honourable institution. ancient as having subsisted since time immemorial, and honourable as tending in every particular to render all men who so will conform to its precepts. Or maybe this one. The records of our fraternity inform us that the usages and customs among Masons have ever corresponded to those of the ancient Egyptians, to which they bear a near affinity. Their philosophers, unwilling to expose their mysteries to vulgar eyes, sound familiar? That's because of William Preston. Now, in the 1800s, the formation of the Grand Lodge of England in 1813, again in that second decade, has ramifications for the type of Freemasonry that goes out around the English Freemason world and in Australia. The physical meeting changes fundamentally. The table leaves the lodge room and lodge officers take up their permanent positions around the lodge room. Coinciding with these changes in the 1800s was a period of growth in the construction of specifically designed buildings to house lodge rooms. Now, there's a few reasons why lodges started to build their own buildings in the 1800s. Changes in the lodge room layout necessitated a larger room. Desirability of having a permanent dedicated lodge room. You don't have to pack it up every month or whenever. And the temperance movement, which really took off in the 1820s, made meeting in public establishments that served alcohol somewhat unseemly. And there was a real movement to get Freemasons out of pubs and clubs because of the temperance movement. Here's our first two lodge buildings in Melbourne. 1858 on our left, and 1876 on our right. They're Melbourne ones. Now, the physical membership of lodges in the 1800s ebbed and flowed. One reason was competition, as during the 1800s there was an explosion in friendly societies, which also had a fraternal side, many of which developed a 3-degree system. The temperance movement alone spawned a plethora of friendly societies dedicated to the absence of alcohol, such as the Good Templars and the Rechabites. And friendly societies appealed to the working man because of the benefits they offered. And some researchers have argued that in the 1800s, and particularly in the early decades of the 1800s, there was an exodus of working men from Freemasonry to the friendly societies. And there's just a brief grab of some of the friendly societies. My favourite's down the bottom there, the group of Druids. Conversely, in the 1800s, there was a growth of the British Empire. Freemasonry became a desirable activity and considered a must for any man of substance travelling the empire. As the empire expanded, so did Freemasonry. And here in Victoria, Freemasonry in the late 1800s and early 1900s was becoming an elitist organisation. Peter Thornton writes in his History of Freemasonry that during this period, he's talking the late 1800s, an increasing number of well-qualified Englishmen were taking up residence in Victoria, and Masonry was beginning to show signs of an avenue of which to display class distinction, with qualifications and embargoes which were considered essential to keep the menial classes out of Freemasonry. Dorothy Wickham, in her book Freemasonry on the Goldfields, indeed highlights how Freemasonry in Victoria in the late 1800s, through the use of high dues and fees, was primarily restricted to well-heeled gentlemen. So, what constituted education in this period? Well, one of the other effects stemming from the formation of the United Grand Lodge of England in 1813 was an agreed form of ritual, but it was not written down. Past masters had to go to exemplifications of it, but they were not allowed to write anything down. So in 1800s, we find this expanding upon the catechism lectures to the recital of ritual, very much influenced by the work of William Preston. And there's William Preston there, and just some of the rituals that developed during the 1800s. And this led to the formation of lodges of instruction, such as the Emulation Lodge of Improvement, founded in 1823, renowned for its strict adherence to precise verbal detail, fixed and unaltered, and as we know it, the emulation ritual. And on that point, when the first lodge was founded here in Melbourne in 1840, John Stevenson was the only experienced pastmaster in Melbourne who knew the oral ritual. So he constituted, consecrated, installed the worshipful master, and invested all the offices. Took him all day. The important difference here is that Masonic education in lodges of instruction, such as the famous Emulation Lodge of Instruction, was about the words. The ritual ruled. And I expect that however, that for many Freemasons during the 1800s, Masonic education was best summed up by the Australian historian Alan Atkinson when he described Freemason Lachlan Macquarie, who became Governor of New South Wales in 1810, as one of those Freemasons who liked polished manhood and good friends rather than arcane knowledge. So the 1900s, what constituted a lodge? Well, in terms of the lodge, and here I'm speaking experience of the Victorian Constitution, but I'm fairly sure it's a similar story in other countries influenced by English Freemasonry. Possibly not so in the US though. Prior to World War I, there were few lodges that had their own lodge buildings, with many still meeting in taverns. Membership varied, with a large lodge perhaps having around 100 members. After World War I, we had a huge increase in membership, 100% increase in less than 10 years. And consequently, there was a frenzy of building activities in the early 1920s to construct large lodge rooms to cater for the huge increase in numbers. Just as an aside, a lot of them got into the trouble when the Depression hit because they'd forked out so much money in the early 1920s to construct these huge buildings. By 1930, for example, the Windsor Lodge here in Melbourne had a membership of over 250 members. No wonder they built such enormous lodge rooms. If all of those members turned up and visitors, you needed an enormous room to hold them all. And just finally, I might get controversial here, during the 1900s, what constituted education? Well, here in Victoria, I'm going to say that Masonic education was not overlooked, it was more overshadowed. Post-World War I, men joined Freemasonry primarily for the fraternity of male companionship, a personal morality, and social capital in terms of the place of distinction in society. But unfortunately, as Brother David Beagley suggests, Freemasonry and Freemasons became very insular during the post-war periods of the 1900s, and they closed their lodge doors to the outside world. But Freemasonry served a useful need in those post-World War periods by providing a sanctuary for men who had shared similar wartime experiences, and by focusing on the drilling of ceremonial movements and the recitation of word-perfect ritual, they were able to forget the traumas of war. However, this military influence post-World War I, and here in Victoria, led to the parade ground entering the lodge room. Emphasis on military precision of ceremonial movements became the norm. This suited men who joined in both those post-war periods, as the majority of them, well, a bit of a generalisation here, were not really interested in the introspective elements alluded to in Freemasonry. And in lodges of instruction, the ceremonial now ruled. Lodges of instruction focused on the movements, and books of ceremonial workings expanded exponentially. And just as an aside, in August 1911, here in Victoria, the Victorian Lodge of Research was consecrated, and one of its stated aims was to assist in the promulgation of a standard ritual and ceremonial. However, the work of the Victorian Lodge of Research was not always appreciated. For example, at a conference of secretaries on the 26th of September 1928, it was moved that lodges in Victoria, and I quote, have at least one night a year set aside for a lecture on some aspect of Freemasonry. The response from very worshipful Brother Beck from the United Press Lodge was that, in his experience, it was not altogether in favour of lectures. He had known cases when a lecture was announced to be delivered and there was a falling off of attendance. He believed that brethren were not tired of degree work. Witnessing degree work every night was always refreshing. He would not like to see lectures made compulsory in addition to the work of lodges. In fact, there's a lodge of research that meets in Melbourne, and lectures are regularly delivered in that lodge, and it would be somewhat surprising to find out how many of brethren attended those lectures. Brackets, laughter. So, in summary, obviously over 300 years, what constituted the physical lodge has dramatically changed and may change again today. Whilst the concept of education in the lodge room has gone through various incarnations. In the 1700s, there was a brief catechism with lectures and discussion on architecture and the latest scientific advancements. In the 1800s, we moved from catechisms to set-piece memorised ritual, influenced by the writings of William Preston. And in the 1900s, particularly here in Victoria, there's a greater emphasis on ceremonial working whilst maintaining that memorised oral ritual. However, as Freemasonry moved into the 21st century, real efforts have been made to give Masonic education greater emphasis, and this has changed how education in Freemasonry is now perceived and delivered. And without, blowing my own trumpet, I seriously believe in Victoria we have made progress in delivering education that helps develop the whole man. We've got Masonic advancements programs, Certificate of Masonic Studies, which is now fully online, Freemasons Victoria online education program, leadership and development courses, and in the second decade of the 1600s, we have the Virtual Lodge that hopefully will be a catalyst for change as new technologies become available. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Junior Warden.
Stop the share. Questions, debate, discussion?
Now, the way we're going to work this is, brethren, you can do a hands-up system. So if, Brother Nicholas Lane, if you could unmute yourself and explain to everybody how to actually put your hand up, I can unmute you, you can ask your question, and we'll see how best we can answer it.
So, brethren, I was suggesting to the Worshipful Master, the best way you can do this is just put your hand up here like this. There's also the hand up message here. The reason I say that is the Worshipful Master can tile through. He can then see you as you ask a question. I've noticed that this works quite well, and it makes it easy for us to recognize who wants to be the next speaker. Brethren, I found your topic very good tonight. Obviously, I would agree with you. We found a lot of the same similarities in the Commonwealth here in Canada as well. Obviously, being a Canadian lodge, my bricks and mortar lodge in Burlington, Ontario, has been around for 150 years, and we too have seen the change that you discussed. I know our lodge had a membership at a high of 350 men, and hence the reason we started 2 other lodges after that as children to our lodge. So I'm sure, like others in this room, we have a broad history. But again, just raise your hand for the Worshipful Master to see, and then he could pick you up and take you off mute.
Brother Robert Billy.
Worshipful Master, yeah, that presentation was excellent from Brendan. I'm particularly interested in the mention of William Preston. Brendan, I'm keen to know more about did he write the whole first degree tracing board lecture? Did he write the second and third degree tracing board lectures as well? What else can we know?
Brother Brendan, you've muted yourself and we've missed everything you've just said.
Sorry, I was just holding that up. What he actually did was he got people to go around to all the lodges in England that they could get to. They brought all the stuff back to him, and then he wrote this book. And what's happened is this book's pretty much become a lot of what we know as the ritual. So have a look at it. You can find it even in our library. Preston's Illustrations of Masonry. The curious thing is there's not a single illustration in it. It's a different use of the term illustration, but you pick it up and go, there's no illustrations. But when you read it, you go, wow, this is what becomes the emulation ritual. So it's amazing the influence that one man had on what we still have today. Fascinating stuff. I only picked that up not all that long ago, and I'd highly recommend it if you're interested in where our ritual has come from.
Fantastic, thank you.
Anyone else got a question that they'd like to add? Oh, there we go, Brother Chris. I'm trying to unmute you, but it's not working. There we go.
That's okay. I've got it here. Yeah, Brendan, very interested in that the number of members after the First World War sort of doubled. Have you got any figures on what happened at the end of the Second World War? Did they double again?
Very similar, but the First World War was a greater increase. I mean, in terms of sheer numbers, the Second World War was just more people, but in terms of percentage, First World War was 100% increase in less than 10 years. Second World War, I don't think the percentage is that high, but there's still an enormous influx of people. But we already had the huge lodge buildings, so it wasn't a problem. We'd already built them in the 1920s. So it suited our purpose. You know, lots of people coming in, huge buildings. And it's that point that we start to build the outer suburban lodge buildings, which are really, some of them quite large as well. We didn't build small lodge buildings. It's just, and that's the point I was alluding to at the end, perhaps today with much smaller lodges, you find if 40 people meet in one of those lodge rooms, it feels empty. And, you know, you go to the south, or the refectory as some call it, to have the meal afterwards, and 40 people in this enormous room kind of loses the atmosphere. So possibly in future we may have to look at smaller venues, and that's happening. Lodges are starting to meet in clubs again here in Melbourne. There's about 3 lodges or 4 now that meet in non-Masonic premises, clubs. One of them meets at a student house in Carlton now, doesn't it? I think. So yeah, it's got to change again.
Yeah, I was also interested that the military aspect had such a change to Victorian Freemasonry. It'd be interesting to look at the cultural differences and influences in various countries, actually, to see whether they had similar sort of influences or they headed off in a different direction.
Well, it's cute. We have got some overseas brethren here in your countries, the United States, Canada. Did the parade ground come into the lodge room during the 1900s?
Yes, it does. And I think that speaking on behalf of, sorry, I unmuted myself. So as a Canadian, we actually have in the Grand Lodge of Canada in the province of Ontario, active lodges that still are fully constituted in the theaters as well. So we had a lodge in Afghanistan with an active membership as well. So I will send Brother Secretary a report. It was written as called the apron and the rifle as well. And I'll take myself off mute. I see some other members.
Thanks,
Brother Eric, you had one to say?
Hi, I just want to share insight on 2 things. One for New South Wales as we practice it, as well as one for the United States in particular. For New South Wales, it is very similar to Victoria, where our founders who developed the New South Wales ritual were men of the military. If you've ever seen the New South Wales signs, they are very militaristic. And I think brothers from New South Wales and brothers who have visited New South Wales they know the New South Wales sign. You know that they're militaristic when you see it. And secondly, specifically speaking for the American brothers, they did have a very big, the military or the paramilitary even had a very big influence in American Masonry, even in the Civil War period. So if you see the Knights Templars in the United States, they have different regalia on their own. You can see that they're wearing Civil War era uniforms for their Knight Templars, and that comes from the military aspect of it. I mean, here in Sydney or here in Commonwealth jurisdictions, we see Knights Templars in mantles, so it's very different from what they practice, and I guess it affected other friendly societies as well, much like the Knights of Columbus, which were very similar regalia to the Knights Templars of the United States.
We got any other questions, brethren?
just like to make another observation. Somebody who's moves backwards and forwards between two constitutions, between Grand Lodge of Victoria and Grand Lodge of Tasmania. It's particularly noticeable to me the more emphasis on the ritual, on the movements in Victoria than Tasmania. And it's amazing. You don't sort of think too much about it until you find yourself in a meeting and you go, well, this is actually quite different. The focus is in a different place. Just wondering in future meetings, perhaps we could explore what happens in some other parts of the world to see whether they do have such a strong influence.
Well, just on that point, Chris, a young Mason here attended an installation in New South Wales a few weeks ago. And he came up to me and said, they've got it all wrong. They don't do it like we do it. And I said, no, they don't. You know, we're sort of unique how we do it. But he was amazed that it was different. He only had to go to New South Wales and Freemasonry was suddenly different. Yeah, you just got to go a few hundred miles and it changed.
Brother Charles Ray, you had something to say? I think he's frozen now. Brother Neil Collette, if I can unmute you. Hold on a second.
If I may, Worshipful Master, the paper was well composed.
Yeah. You lost.
We've lost him.
Thank you, Worshipful Master.
Go for it, Neil.
Thank you, Worshipful Master. I'm also a member of a lodge that meets in the Isle of Man over in the UK, under the Grand Lodge of England. And I've been fortunate to attend a number of meetings over there, including many installations. And whilst the degree work carried out is very similar, it's certainly not in such a, as we would say, military fashion to what it is here in Victoria. So they're my observations. The ceremonies are carried out very well, but for example, you know, the deacons can transverse diagonally across the squared pavement and all those sorts of things. It's not done with the same military precision as we have here in Victoria. So although the message is still the same, it's just told in a slightly different manner. I've also been to lodges in Scotland, and they're also not as military in their ceremonial as we are here in Victoria. Thank you, Worshipful Master.
Thank you.
I did mention during that point that one of the reasons the Victorian Lodge of Research was founded was to help with the ceremonial and ritual here in Victoria. And you've got us to blame because it was at a meeting in, I think, the early 1930s, where a guy did an exemplification of, I think it was a first degree. He was the director of ceremonies and he carried a baton. Normally, a director of ceremonies would traditionally carry a wand or a staff. He did an exemplification with a baton, and everyone went, I'll have one of those, thanks. And that was a fundamental change. Soon as the director of ceremonies has got a baton tacked under his arm, he's got a swagger stick. He starts marching. You don't do that if you're carrying a staff in a diagonal position in front of you. That's just my point.
Most Worshipful Brother Ray, are you able to chat to us now? Charles Ray? Oh, I think we've lost him completely. Most Worshipful Brother Murray.
I'm just interested, Brendan, you talk about the Lodge of Instruction or Lodge of Research and its involvement. My understanding is that Victoria, when it was formed as United Grand Lodge of Victoria in the 1889, didn't have a standard ritual at that stage. It was sometime around 1906 that a Grand Master said it would be his preference for a standard ritual to be developed or encouraged. But there was some resistance from the lodges at that time to having a standard ritual. We've now developed to have a Book of Lodge Workings, which is I don't know how many pages it's in it. It's certainly well over 100 pages. So whilst I'm interested to see how we've developed and changed, one thing which I'm still not quite clear on is whilst we brought a militaristic style in it, when did it become the norm for lodges in Victoria to have one ritual?
Just going from my recollections of Thornton, for those of you who aren't in Victoria, he's written a couple of history books on the history of Freemasonry in Victoria. I think he actually says that they did have a standard ritual by the late 1800s. It's just it kind of sat on the table for quite some time until that Grand Master came along and said, I think we should make this happen. And from memory, I think it was which Grand Master? Balls Hadley, the doctor. He quietly went round to all the country lodges and said, this is the ritual you should use. Naturally they did, and I kind of think it took off from that. And I think the impetus was that some of the lodges were saying, we're using different ritual with the guy down the road, it's getting a bit messy. And that's when Balls Hadley decided he'd just quietly go around and say, look, use this one and we'll all be good. I think we can credit Balls Hadley with our standard, well, basically the emulation ritual.
Brother Robert Billy?
Yeah, thank you. Brendan, you mentioned that your certificate of Masonic education is now completely online. I didn't realise that. I wonder if you can spruik it a little bit. And is that available to people outside Victoria as well?
Yes, it is. The only probably drawback is there's one module on the history of Freemasonry in Victoria, which might seem a little out of place if, say, you're living in Arizona. You'll kind of go, yeah, what the hell's this? But yeah, you can do it if you want to. I can send you the link. When I say it's online, we only finished putting the last couple of modules together over Christmas, and it's now with our IT department for loading. But as far as I'm concerned, it's done. It's there. I can send you the link. The first 4 have been up for about 4 or 5 months now, and there's people working their way through it, and the last 4 are just going online now. So in theory, the whole 8-module course is now available online.
Fantastic. Would love the link.
And we've tried to make it so it's not just text. So again, you'll have links to film clips, all sorts of stuff. Found this really nice clip because they're dealing with the issue of the Hiram key and Robert Lomas, and I forget the other guy's name. I actually found a talk where one of them explains the basis of their book. And he's doing it to a live audience for about an hour. So if you don't want to read the book, here's this guy explaining basically what their book's about. So we've got that kind of stuff in there as much as possible, just to make it interesting.
Have we got any other questions, brethren? Put a hand up. I'll see if I can see you. If I've missed anyone, can you unmute yourself? I think that's pretty much it. Thank you, Brother Junior Warden and Brother Senior Warden, for your lectures delivered tonight for our flagship night. It was great. I enjoyed it thoroughly.